garden was too quiet for a man who had something to say. Elena Marchetti noticed it first, the way Alexander stood near the stone bench with his hands clasped behind his back instead of reaching for hers the way he always did. The autumn wind moved through the hedges, carrying the smell of wet leaves and something colder, something she could not yet name. She had walked into this garden 100 times before, always with a light heart, always certain of where she stood with him. Today her steps slowed without her permission. "You wanted to see me," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I did." Alexander did not look at her. He looked instead at the fountain behind her, as though the water held the words he needed. "There is something I must tell you, Elena, and I am sorry that I cannot make it easier." She felt the air shift, the way it does before a storm breaks over open fields. Still, she waited. She had learned patience from a life that had never given her much else. "My mother has arranged a match for me," he said finally. "Lady Cordelia Ashworth. The families have already spoken. It is expected that I honor this arrangement." For a long moment, Elena said nothing. The wind kept moving through the hedges, indifferent to the two people standing frozen in its path. "And what do you want, Alexander?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything she needed to know. A man who truly wanted her would not have hesitated. A man who truly loved her would have found a way to fight for what he wanted, rather than standing in a garden explaining why he could not. "I want to do what is right for my family," he said. "I have a duty, Elena. A duke does not simply choose for himself. There are expectations, obligations that come before feeling." She almost laughed at the word feeling, spoken so carefully, as though it were something dangerous he had to hold at arm's length. But laughter would not serve her here. Only her composure would. "Then you have made your choice," she said. "Elena." "No." She lifted a hand gently, not in anger, but in a quiet request for him to let her finish. "You do not need to explain yourself further. You have told me what I need to know, and I thank you for your honesty. Many men would have let this drag on, would have kept me waiting for a future they never intended to give me. You did not do that. For that, at least, I am grateful." Alexander looked at her then, truly looked at her, and something in his expression flickered, though he could not name it yet. He had expected tears, he had expected pleading, perhaps even anger directed at him, words he could defend against because he had prepared himself for battle. He had not prepared himself for grace. "I wish you every happiness," Elena continued, and her voice did not shake. "I hope Lady Cordelia understands what a fortunate woman she is." She turned before he could answer, her skirts brushing against the gravel path, her spine straight as though an invisible thread pulled her upward from the crown of her head. She did not run. She did not stumble. She walked, one measured step after another, until the garden gate closed behind her with a soft, final click. Only then, once she was certain no one could see her, did her shoulders drop the smallest fraction. Only then did she allow herself one long, unsteady breath. Alexander remained by the fountain long after she had gone, staring at the space where she had stood, trying to understand why victory felt so much like loss. That evening, Elena sat across from her Aunt Charlotte in the small parlor above the bookshop they shared, a cup of tea cooling untouched in her hands. Charlotte was a woman who had buried a husband young and rebuilt her life from the ashes of that grief, and she recognized the particular stillness in her niece's posture. "He ended things," Charlotte said. "It was not a question. He did. And you are sitting here calmly telling me about it, instead of weeping into your pillow." Charlotte set down her own cup. "That is either very brave or very foolish, my dear." Elena managed a small, tired smile. "Perhaps both." "What did you say to him?" "I thanked him for his honesty." Charlotte's eyebrows rose. "You thanked him. What else was there to say? Should I have begged him to choose me over his family's expectations? Should I have wept and made a scene in his mother's garden so that the servants could whisper about it for weeks?" Elena shook her head. "I would rather he remember me standing tall than remember me broken at his feet." Charlotte reached across the small table and took her niece's hand. "You have more strength than most women twice your age, Elena. But strength does not mean you cannot feel the loss. It is allowed to hurt." "I know it hurts," Elena admitted, and for the first time that evening her voice wavered. "I simply refuse to let him see it." They sat together in comfortable silence as the candle burned low, the shop beneath them full of stories that had survived far worse endings than heartbreak. Miles away, in the grand halls of Whitmore Manor, Alexander sat alone in his study long after the household had gone to sleep. His mother, Margaret, believed the matter settled. The papers regarding the arrangement with the Ashworth family would be signed within the fortnight. He should have felt satisfaction. He should have felt the quiet relief of duty fulfilled. Instead, he kept remembering the way Elena had looked at him in that garden, not with anger, not with desperation, but with a calm dignity that made him feel, for the first time in his life, genuinely small. He had ended things gently, or so he had told himself. He had chosen his words with care, had tried to soften the blow. Yet nothing about her reaction had needed softening. She had simply accepted it, thanked him, and walked away, as though he were the one who should feel unsettled. And he did feel unsettled. That was the part he could not explain to himself. He poured a glass of brandy he did not drink, and stared at the fire until it burned down to embers, turning over the memory of her steady voice again and again, searching for the crack in her composure that he was certain must be there. He found none. That absence troubled him more than tears ever could have. The following morning, Elena rose early, dressed plainly, and made her way down to the bookshop before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops. Work, she had learned long ago, was its own kind of medicine. There were shelves to dust, ledgers to balance, customers who would arrive within the hour expecting warm greetings and helpful recommendations, regardless of what had happened in her heart the evening before. Her friend Grace arrived shortly after, cheeks pink from the cold, a basket of fresh bread balanced on her hip. "You look tired," Grace observed, setting the basket on the counter. "I did not sleep well." Grace studied her for a moment, then set down the bread and crossed her arms. Something happened with the Duke. Elena busied herself arranging a stack of novels, avoiding her friend's gaze. "It is finished, Grace. There is nothing more to discuss." Finished, meaning he ended it, or finished meaning you ended it. Does it matter? "It matters a great deal," Grace said gently. "One means you are heartbroken and hiding it. The other means you are simply tired." Elena finally looked up, and something in her expression must have answered the question, because Grace's face softened with sympathy rather than surprise. "His mother arranged a match for him," Elena said quietly. "Lady Cordelia Ashworth. He came to tell me himself, at least. I suppose I should be thankful for that small mercy. And you are simply going to accept it, let him walk away without a fight?" "What fight would you have me wage, Grace? Shall I storm his family's estate and demand he choose love over duty, as though we live in one of these novels?" Elena gestured at the shelves around them. "This is not a story. This is my life, and I intend to live it with whatever dignity I have left." Grace was quiet for a moment, then reached out and squeezed her friend's hand. "Dignity suits you, but do not let it become a wall that keeps you from ever feeling anything again." Elena did not answer, because she was not certain she had one to give. Instead, she turned back to the shelves, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of her work, letting the quiet order of the bookshop steady the parts of her that still ached from the night before. Outside, the city moved on as it always did, indifferent to broken hearts and Duke's decisions alike. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, merchants called out to passers-by, and somewhere across town, in a manner far grander than the small rooms above the bookshop, a man sat staring at a signed agreement that should have brought him peace, and instead left him with a hollow, gnawing sense that he had made a terrible mistake. Neither of them yet understood how far that mistake would travel, or how long it would take before the truth of it finally caught up to him. For now, there was only the quiet after the storm, and two people learning, in very different ways, how to carry on. Elena spent the following days building a new kind of routine, one where mornings began with ledgers instead of letters, and evenings ended with the comfort of her aunt's company, instead of the anticipation of a garden meeting that would never come again. She did not speak of Alexander unless someone else raised his name first, and even then, her responses remained brief, composed, careful. But composure, she was discovering, was a heavier thing to carry than anyone realized. It required constant maintenance, like a garden that must be tended even when no one is watching. Some nights, alone in her small room above the shop, she allowed herself a few private tears, quiet and controlled, the kind that left no trace by morning. She told herself this was healing. She told herself that time, given enough patience, would smooth over even the deepest wounds. She did not yet know that the man who had caused those wounds was beginning to unravel in his own quiet way, question by question, doubt by doubt, until the arrangement he had accepted out of duty would no longer feel like enough. For now, she simply lived, one careful day after another, refusing to let anyone see the cost of her grace. Margaret Whitmore had never once doubted that her son would do as expected. She had raised him for exactly this purpose, to understand that a title carried weight, and that weight required sacrifice. When she learned that the arrangement with the Ashworth family had finally been settled, she allowed herself a rare smile over breakfast, one that did not quite reach her eyes. "Lady Cordelia will make an excellent duchess," she said, buttering her toast with brisk efficiency. "Her family's connections alone will secure our standing for a generation. You have made a wise choice, Alexander." Alexander said nothing. He stirred his tea long after it had gone cold, watching the small whirlpool his spoon created, as though answers might rise up from the surface if he looked long enough. "You seem distracted," Margaret observed. "I am simply tired, Mother." "Tired men do not sign contracts that determine the future of an entire estate," she said, setting down her knife with a small, precise click. "Is there something troubling you?" There was a great deal troubling him, but none of it was something he could explain to a woman who had built her entire understanding of the world around duty and family standing. He could not tell her that he kept seeing Elena's calm expression in the moments before sleep took him, or that her quiet acceptance of his decision had begun to feel less like relief, and more like an accusation he could not answer. "No, Mother," he said instead. "Nothing at all." Margaret studied him a moment longer, then returned to her breakfast, satisfied enough with the answer, though not entirely convinced. The engagement to Lady Cordelia Ashworth moved forward with the efficient coldness of a well-oiled machine. There were dinners to attend, introductions to make, a growing list of social obligations that Alexander fulfilled with the mechanical precision of a man performing a role rather than living a life. Cordelia herself was, by every external measure, an excellent match. She was clever, well-spoken, capable of holding her own in any conversation regardless of the subject, and entirely aware of exactly what she wanted from this arrangement. What she wanted, Alexander came to realize during their third dinner together, was status. Not him, not particularly, but the position his name would grant her, the doors it would open, the influence it would carry. "You seem quiet this evening," Cordelia remarked one night, over a meal neither of them was truly enjoying. "Is something on your mind?" "Simply considering the future," Alexander said carefully. "A wise habit for a man in your position." Cordelia sipped her wine, entirely unbothered. "I have already begun considering how we might renovate the east wing of Whitmore Manor. It would make an excellent space for entertaining, don't you think? Far more suited to hosting than that dreary old library your father was so fond of." Alexander thought of his father's library, of the quiet hours he had spent there as a boy, and something in his chest tightened uncomfortably. "The library holds a great deal of history, Cordelia. I would prefer it remain as it is." Of course," she said, waving a hand dismissively, though her tone suggested the matter was far from settled in her own mind. "There will be time enough to discuss such things once we are properly married." He found himself, later that night, comparing the conversation to countless others he had shared with Elena, conversations that had never once revolved around status or renovation, but around ideas, books, small moments of genuine laughter that asked nothing of him except his honest presence. He tried to push the comparison away. It served no purpose now. The agreement was signed, the path was set, and yet the comparison returned, night after night, like water finding its way through the smallest crack in a dam. Across the city, Elena's days had settled into a rhythm that, if not joyful, was at least steady. The bookshop kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, and Charlotte's quiet companionship provided a comfort that required no explanation. She had begun taking on more responsibility for the shop's finances, discovering a genuine satisfaction in balancing the ledgers, in watching small, careful decisions turn modest profits into steady growth. "You have a talent for this," Charlotte told her one afternoon, reviewing the numbers Elena had prepared. "A genuine talent. I have never seen the account so well organized." "It occupies my mind," Elena admitted. "I find I prefer numbers to daydreams these days. Numbers do not disappoint you, they simply are what they are." Charlotte gave her a knowing look but said nothing further on the matter, understanding that her niece needed this quiet distraction more than she needed conversation about it. It was during this time that Elena met Henry Ashford, a soft-spoken gentleman of modest fortune, who had taken to visiting the shop regularly, under the thin excuse of searching for books on agricultural improvement, a subject Elena strongly suspected held far less interest for him than her company did. Henry was kind, patient, and entirely without the complications that came attached to titles and family expectations. He asked for nothing beyond conversation, and slowly, without either of them quite naming it, a gentle friendship began to grow. "You seem lost in thought again," Henry observed one afternoon, as Elena absently rearranged a shelf of poetry she had already organized twice that week. "Forgive me, my mind wanders more than it should these days." "There is no need to apologize," Henry said, leaning against the counter with easy familiarity. "I simply hope whatever occupies your thoughts is kind to you." Elena managed a small smile. "It is a work in progress." Henry did not press further, and she was grateful for that restraint. He seemed content simply to exist alongside her, to share quiet moments discussing books and small city gossip, without demanding that she reveal wounds she was not yet ready to share. Word of Alexander's engagement traveled through the city with the particular speed that only scandal and society news could achieve. Elena heard of it first through Grace, who arrived at the shop one morning with an expression that suggested she was carrying news she did not particularly want to deliver. "The engagement has been formally announced," Grace said carefully. "There is to be a gala next month to celebrate it. All of society will be there." Elena kept her hands steady as she continued sorting through a stack of ledgers. "I see." Charlotte received an invitation as well, given her standing with several of the city's merchant families. "She mentioned she thought you might wish to attend." "Why would I wish to attend a celebration of his engagement, Grace?" "Because," Grace said gently, "hiding away and pretending you do not care will only feed the very gossip you wish to avoid. If you attend, calm and composed as you always are, no one will have anything to whisper about. If you stay away, they will invent a story far crueler than the truth." Elena considered this for a long moment. There was a certain painful logic to it, the kind of practical wisdom that Grace had always possessed in greater measure than most people twice her age. "And if I cannot bear to see him standing beside her, then you will bear it anyway," Grace said, not unkindly. "You have already proven you can carry difficult things with grace. This will be no different." Elena did not answer immediately, but as the days passed and the gala drew closer, she found herself returning again and again to Grace's words, weighing them against her own reluctance, until finally she decided that her friend was right. She would attend. She would stand tall, exactly as she had in the garden, and she would give no one the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Alexander, meanwhile, had no idea that Elena intended to attend the very celebration meant to mark the end of any possibility between them. He moved through his days with a growing sense of unease he could not quite name, attending fittings for a wedding he had not yet fully allowed himself to imagine, signing documents that felt increasingly like the closing of a door he was not entirely certain he wished to close. One evening, unable to sleep, he found himself wandering into his father's old library, the very room Cordelia had dismissed so easily. He ran his fingers along the spines of books his father had collected over a lifetime, until his hand paused on a small, worn journal tucked between two larger volumes. Curious, he pulled it free and opened it to find his father's handwriting, faded but legible, filling page after page with private thoughts Alexander had never known existed. He began to read, and what he found there would, within days, begin to unravel everything he thought he understood about duty, sacrifice, and the true cost of choosing family expectation over the quiet, steady pull of the heart. For now, he simply sat in the dim candlelight, turning pages, discovering a version of his father he had never known, while across the city, Elena prepared herself, in her own quiet way, for a night that neither of them yet realized would change everything. The days leading up to the gala passed with a strange, suspended quality, as though the entire city were holding its breath in anticipation of an event that carried far more weight than a simple celebration. Elena spent an evening with Charlotte selecting a gown from the small collection they had carefully maintained. Nothing extravagant, but elegant in its simplicity. The deep green fabric catching candlelight in a way that made her look, Charlotte insisted, entirely radiant. "You do not need jewels or elaborate designs to command a room, my dear," Charlotte said, adjusting the fabric at Elena's shoulder. "You need only walk in as though you belong there, because you do." "I am not certain I believe that." "Then believe it for one evening," Charlotte said firmly. "For one evening, walk in as though the world owes you nothing, and you owe it nothing in return." Elena studied her reflection in the small mirror, searching for some trace of the woman who had wept quietly into her pillow only weeks before. She found, instead, someone steadier than she expected, someone who had survived a wound and was still standing. Across the city, Alexander stood before his own mirror, adjusting the collar of his formal coat while his valet fussed over small details that felt, to him, entirely meaningless. His father's journal sat on his bedside table, its pages now well worn from repeated reading, filled with confessions Alexander had never expected to find. A story of a young man who had once loved a woman of modest means, only to abandon her for a marriage arranged to satisfy his own mother's ambitions, a decision his father had carried as quiet regret for the remainder of his life. "I have given this family everything it asked of me," his father had written in one particularly worn passage, "and yet some nights I still wonder what my life would have been, had I chosen differently. Do not make my mistake, if ever you find yourself standing where I once stood." Alexander had read those words a dozen times now, and each time they settled deeper into his chest, refusing to be ignored. He had thought, before finding the journal, that his father's marriage to his mother had simply been the natural order of things, an arrangement neither man nor woman questioned. He had never imagined that beneath his father's steady, dutiful exterior lay a lifetime of quiet longing for a different path entirely. He closed the journal, tucked it carefully into a drawer, and made his way downstairs to join Cordelia for the carriage ride to the gala, his father's warning echoing louder in his mind with every step. The ballroom of Ashworth House glittered with more light than Elena had seen in months. Hundreds of candles reflected endlessly in tall mirrors that lined the walls, turning the entire space into something that felt less like a room and more like the inside of a jewel. Musicians tuned their instruments in a far corner, and the low hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by bursts of laughter from guests who had already begun sampling the evening's wine. Elena stood at the entrance beside Charlotte, her hand steady on her aunt's arm, taking a slow breath before stepping fully into the room. "Remember," Charlotte murmured, "you belong here as much as anyone." Elena nodded, though her heart had already begun to beat faster than she would have liked. She scanned the crowd instinctively, searching for a familiar face, and found Grace near the refreshment table, waving her over with a relieved expression, as though she had been worried Elena might change her mind at the last moment. "You came," Grace said, embracing her briefly. "You look wonderful. I feel as though everyone is watching me." "No one is watching you," Grace said, though her eyes flicked briefly toward a cluster of women whispering behind their fans, clearly doing exactly that. "Ignore them. Enjoy the evening. That is the entire point." Elena allowed herself to be led further into the room, accepting a glass of wine she did not intend to drink, exchanging polite greetings with acquaintances who offered careful, searching smiles, clearly curious how she would behave on a night meant to celebrate the very engagement that had ended her own hopes. She met each smile with calm politeness, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing discomfort in her expression. Across the room, Alexander stood beside Cordelia, greeting a steady stream of guests, his expression carefully arranged into the polite mask expected of a man in his position. Cordelia moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting congratulations with gracious nods, occasionally glancing at Alexander, as though checking that he remained properly positioned beside her, an accessory to complete the picture, rather than a partner sharing in genuine joy. It was nearly an hour into the evening when Alexander first saw her. Elena stood near the edge of the dance floor, laughing at something Grace had said, her green gown catching the candlelight exactly as Charlotte had predicted, making her look, to Alexander's eyes, more radiant than anyone else in the entire room. He felt the breath leave his chest as though he had been struck, and for a long moment, he simply stared, unable to look away. She had not fallen apart. She had not hidden herself away in shame or grief. She stood there, laughing, beautiful, entirely herself, as though the events of that autumn garden had never touched her at all. "Alexander," Cordelia's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp with impatience. "You are not listening." "Forgive me," he said, forcing his attention back to her. "What were you saying?" "I was saying that Lady Pemberton has asked whether we intend to honeymoon abroad. I believe Paris would be an excellent choice, given the current fashions there." "Of course," Alexander said absently, though his eyes had already drifted back across the room. Henry Ashford approached Elena not long after, offering a polite bow and an invitation to dance that made Grace's eyebrows lift with interest. Elena hesitated only a moment before accepting, allowing him to lead her onto the floor as the musicians began a gentle waltz. Alexander watched, jaw tightening, as Henry's hand settled at Elena's waist, as she smiled up at him with an ease that seemed entirely genuine. He told himself the tightness in his chest was simple surprise, nothing more, but the feeling refused to be so easily dismissed. "Who is that man dancing with Miss Marchetti?" he asked, before he could stop himself. Cordelia followed his gaze, unbothered. "Henry Ashford, I believe. Modest fortune, but respectable enough family. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Alexander said quickly, though the lie sat poorly on his tongue. The dance ended, and Henry escorted Elena from the floor with visible reluctance, clearly hoping for a second turn that Elena, with practiced grace, gently declined, citing a need to rest and catch her breath. She made her way toward a quiet alcove near the tall windows, away from the thickest part of the crowd, and it was there that Alexander found himself, moments later, unable to resist the pull that drew him toward her. "Miss Marchetti," he said, approaching carefully. Elena turned, and for the briefest moment, something flickered across her expression before settling back into calm composure. "Your Grace, congratulations on your engagement." The formality in her voice struck him harder than any anger could have. "Thank you," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "You look well, Elena." "I am well," she said simply. "The bookshop keeps me occupied. Charlotte and I have expanded our collection considerably these past weeks." "I am glad to hear it." He hesitated, searching for something more meaningful to say, something that might close the distance her formality had created. I did not expect to see you here tonight. Charlotte received an invitation, given her standing among the merchant families. I thought it wiser to attend than to hide away and give people reason to whisper. That sounds like wisdom Grace would offer. A small, genuine smile crossed Elena's face before she could stop it. You remember Grace's tendency toward practical advice. I remember a great many things, Alexander said quietly, and something in his tone made Elena's smile fade, replaced by a careful, guarded expression. Alexander, she said, using his given name for the first time that evening, her voice low enough that only he could hear it. You are engaged to be married. Whatever memories you are referring to belong to a chapter that is already closed. I would ask that you not reopen it here, tonight, of all places. Her words landed with quiet precision, and Alexander felt properly chastened, understanding that he had overstepped a boundary she had every right to maintain. You are correct, he said. Forgive me. There is nothing to forgive, Elena said, though her tone suggested otherwise. I hope you find happiness with Lady Cordelia. She excused herself before he could respond further, returning to Grace's side with a composure that revealed nothing of the conversation that had just passed between them. Alexander remained by the window, watching her go, the weight of her words settling over him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that he suspected would not settle for a long time to come. He returned to Cordelia's side for the remainder of the evening, though his attention remained scattered, his responses to conversation growing increasingly distracted. Cordelia noticed, eventually, though she attributed his distraction to the natural nervousness of a man preparing for marriage, rather than anything more troubling. It was near the end of the evening, as guests began preparing to depart, that Alexander overheard a conversation that would linger with him long after the candles had burned to nothing. He had stepped away from the main ballroom, seeking a moment of quiet in a small side corridor, when he heard Cordelia's voice drifting from behind a nearby curtain, speaking to a friend she believed to be alone with her. Honestly, the wedding cannot come soon enough, Cordelia was saying, her voice carrying the particular carelessness of someone who believed no one important could hear her. Once the papers are signed and the ceremony complete, I shall finally have access to the full extent of the Whitmore fortune. Alexander is pleasant enough, I suppose, though rather dull company. But a title is a title, and dull company is a small price to pay for the life it affords. Her friend laughed softly. You make it sound like a business transaction. Is it not? Cordelia replied, entirely unbothered. Marriage among people of our standing has always been a transaction, my dear. Anyone who tells you otherwise is simply unwilling to admit it plainly. Alexander stood frozen in the corridor, the words settling into him with the cold clarity of ice water. He had known, on some level, that Cordelia's interest in him carried more calculation than affection, but hearing it spoken so plainly, with such casual indifference, struck him harder than he had expected. He thought of Elena's warm laughter on the dance floor, her genuine happiness that owed nothing to titles or fortunes, and the contrast between the two women settled over him like a verdict he could no longer avoid. He left the gala shortly after, offering Cordelia a brief excuse about a headache, and rode home in silence, his father's journal waiting for him on his bedside table, its warning echoing louder in his mind with every turn of the carriage wheels. Elena, meanwhile, returned home with Charlotte in considerably better spirits than she had expected, having survived the evening with her dignity intact and even, to her quiet surprise, having enjoyed portions of it genuinely. You handled yourself beautifully tonight, Charlotte said, as their carriage rattled through the quiet streets. I was proud to stand beside you. It was easier than I expected, Elena admitted, though I will confess, seeing him again was not without its difficulty. He approached you. Briefly, I made certain he understood that whatever existed between us belongs firmly in the past. Charlotte studied her niece carefully in the dim carriage light. And do you believe that yourself, or did you simply say it for his benefit? Elena did not answer immediately, staring out the window at the passing streets, considering the question longer than she intended to. I do not know, she admitted finally, but it no longer matters what I believe. He has made his choice, and I intend to build a life that does not depend on whether he ever changes his mind. Charlotte reached over and squeezed her hand, saying nothing further, understanding that some truths took longer to settle than others, and that her niece would find her own way through this particular storm, exactly as she had found her way through every difficulty before it. Neither woman could have known, as their carriage rolled toward home through the quiet, candlelit streets, that miles away, Alexander sat awake with his father's journal open once more across his knees, finally beginning to understand exactly what he stood to lose if he did not find the courage to change course before it was too late. The gala had ended, but for both Elena and Alexander, something far more significant had only just begun. Alexander did not sleep that night. He sat in his father's library until the candles burned low, and dawn began to creep gray through the tall windows, the journal open across his knees, its pages now so familiar he could recite entire passages from memory. He thought of Cordelia's careless words in the corridor, of the cold calculation behind her pleasant smiles, and he thought of Elena, laughing genuinely on the dance floor, asking nothing of him but honesty. By the time the household began to stir, he had made a decision, though he understood it would not be simple to carry out. He found his mother in the morning room, reviewing correspondence over her tea, and closed the door behind him before she had fully looked up. "Mother, I need to speak with you about the engagement." Margaret set down her letter, something in her son's tone catching her attention immediately. "What is it?" "I cannot marry Cordelia." The silence that followed felt heavier than any words could have been. Margaret studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You signed an agreement, Alexander. Do you understand what breaking it would mean for this family's standing?" "I understand it fully," he said, though his voice carried a steadiness he had not felt in weeks. "I overheard her last night, Mother, speaking to a friend, entirely unaware I could hear. She spoke of our marriage as though it were nothing more than a business transaction, a means of accessing this family's fortune. She does not love me. She barely tolerates my company." "Love," Margaret said, the word carrying a note of disdain, "is a luxury, Alexander, not a foundation. Marriages among families such as ours have never been built on such things." "Then perhaps that is precisely the mistake I do not intend to repeat," Alexander said quietly, and he pulled his father's journal from beneath his arm, setting it gently on the table before her. "I found this in the library, Mother. Father's private thoughts, written across many years. He loved a woman once, before you, someone of modest means, someone he was forced to abandon because his own mother arranged a marriage he had no power to refuse. He carried that regret for the rest of his life. He wrote of it again and again, wondering what his life might have been had he chosen differently." Margaret's face had gone pale, her hands still resting on the letter she had been reading moments before. "Your father never spoke of this to me." "Perhaps he could not," Alexander said gently. "Perhaps the weight of that regret was something he carried alone, exactly as you have taught me to carry my own duties alone, without complaint, without question. But I refuse to spend the rest of my life the way he did, Mother, quietly wondering what might have been. I refuse to marry a woman who values my title far more than she values me, when there is another woman entirely who never once asked me for anything beyond honesty." "You are speaking of Miss Marchetti." "I am." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the journal on the table, as though seeing her late husband anew through its worn pages. "Your father loved me, in his own way," she said finally, her voice softer than Alexander had ever heard it. "But I have always suspected there was a part of him I never fully reached. I assumed it was simply his nature, reserved, private. I did not know there was a name for what stood between us. I am sorry, Mother. Do not be sorry on my account." Margaret straightened, some of her usual composure returning, though something in her expression had shifted, softened in a way Alexander had rarely witnessed. "If you truly believe breaking this engagement is the right course, then you must act with courage and honesty, not merely walk away and leave the mess for others to manage. Cordelia's family will be furious, and rightly so. You owe them a proper explanation, delivered with respect, regardless of what you overheard. I intend to speak with Cordelia directly, before anyone else." "Good," Margaret said. "And Alexander." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "If this Miss Marchetti is truly who you believe her to be, do not simply expect her to welcome you back with open arms. You wounded her once, publicly enough that all of society took notice. Winning her trust again will require more than a change of heart. It will require proof, sustained over time, not simply pretty words spoken in a moment of regret." "I understand that, Mother." "Do you?" Margaret's eyes held his, sharp and assessing. "Because I have watched you approach this entire situation as though duty alone determines your worth. If you wish to build a genuine life with this woman, you must learn that love requires effort long after the initial declaration, patience long after the first apology. It is not a single grand gesture. It is 1,000 small ones, repeated faithfully, until trust is rebuilt." Alexander absorbed his mother's words carefully, recognizing in them a wisdom he had not expected to find, hard-won, it seemed, from her own quiet observations of a marriage that had perhaps carried more distance than either she or her husband had ever openly acknowledged. The conversation with Cordelia proved every bit as difficult as Alexander had anticipated. He requested a private meeting the following afternoon, choosing his words with the same careful honesty Elena had once shown him in that autumn garden, though the outcome could not have been more different. "You are ending this," Cordelia said flatly, once he had finished speaking, her expression shifting rapidly from surprise to cold calculation. "After everything has already been announced. After the gala, after the papers, after my family has told all of society that this marriage will proceed. I understand the difficulty this creates, Cordelia, and I take full responsibility for it. I should never have entered this arrangement without being certain of my own heart." "Your heart," Cordelia repeated, with the same disdain his mother had once used for the very same word. "Is this about that woman I saw you speaking with at the gala, the one from the bookshop?" "This is about my own honesty, and yours as well," Alexander said, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building in her expression. "I heard what you said to your friend last night, Cordelia. I heard exactly how you view this marriage, and I understand now that neither of us would have found happiness in it." Cordelia's face went through several rapid changes, calculation giving way briefly to genuine embarrassment before settling into cold resignation. "Very well," she said finally. "I will inform my family that the engagement is ended. I trust you understand the damage this will do to both our reputations." "I do, and I am prepared to bear whatever consequences follow." Cordelia studied him a moment longer, something almost like respect flickering briefly across her features. "You have more spine than I gave you credit for, Alexander. I hope, for your sake, that whoever finally wins your heart appreciates the trouble you are willing to endure for it." She left without further ceremony, and Alexander stood alone in the quiet room, feeling both the weight of the scandal he had just set into motion, and a profound, unexpected relief that settled over him like the first clean breath after a long illness. The news spread through society within days, exactly as both Margaret and Cordelia had predicted, carrying with it a wave of gossip and speculation that Alexander weathered with a patience he had not known he possessed. Some called him foolish, others called him cruel for embarrassing the Ashworth family so publicly, but a quiet few, those who had witnessed his careful, respectful handling of the broken engagement, began to speak of him with a grudging admiration for a man willing to risk his own standing for the sake of honesty. Word eventually reached Elena, delivered once again by Grace, who arrived at the bookshop breathless, with news she clearly considered significant. "He has broken the engagement," Grace announced, setting down her basket without her usual careful arrangement of its contents. "All of society is speaking of nothing else. Lady Cordelia's family is said to be furious." Elena's hands stilled over the ledger she had been reviewing. "Broken it? Why?" "No one knows the full details, though there are whispers he overheard something at the gala that changed his mind entirely." Grace studied her friend carefully. "What will you do, if he comes to find you?" Elena considered the question for a long moment. Memories of the garden, of the gala, of every careful word she had spoken to protect her own dignity, rising up within her in a complicated tangle she was not yet ready to unravel. "I do not know," she admitted finally. "But I do know this. If he comes, gentle words alone will not be enough to undo what has already been done. He will need to prove, through more than promises, that he has truly changed, and that will take time. I am not certain either of us yet possesses." Grace reached across the counter and squeezed her friend's hand, saying nothing further, understanding that whatever came next belonged entirely to Elena to navigate, in her own time, at her own pace. Alexander, meanwhile, spent the following days gathering his courage, understanding fully the weight of his mother's warning that words alone would never be sufficient to rebuild what his own decision had broken. He did not rush toward the bookshop with grand declarations. Instead, he began, quietly and deliberately, to consider exactly what proof of genuine change might look like, determined that whatever came next would be built on patience rather than desperation, on honesty rather than the easy charm that had once made his apologies feel hollow. It would take more than a single visit, more than a single conversation, to earn back what he had so carelessly let go. He understood that now, and for the first time in his life, he found himself entirely willing to do the difficult, patient work that genuine love required. The bell above the bookshop door chimed softly one gray afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after news of the broken engagement had settled into the quieter corners of society's gossip. Elena was arranging a new shipment of novels when she heard the familiar sound, and something in the particular hesitation of the footsteps that followed made her pause before turning around. Alexander stood just inside the doorway, dressed simply, without the formal trappings that usually accompanied his public appearances. He held his hat in both hands, turning it slowly, the posture of a man who had rehearsed his words many times, and still felt uncertain whether any of them would be enough. Elena, he said quietly. She set down the book she had been holding, keeping her expression carefully neutral. Your Grace. Please, he said. Alexander, if you are willing to grant me that much. Elena studied him for a long moment, noting the tiredness around his eyes, the absence of the polished confidence he usually carried into any room. What brings you here, Alexander? I came to apologize, he said, though I understand fully that an apology alone will not undo what I have already done. No, Elena agreed, it will not. He nodded, as though he had expected exactly this response and had prepared himself for it. I do not ask you to forgive me today, or even this week. I only ask that you allow me the chance to show you, over time, that I have changed, that the man who stood in that garden and let duty override his own heart is not the man standing before you now. Elena crossed her arms, though not unkindly, simply protecting herself against words that might otherwise move her too quickly. You broke my heart once already, Alexander, in front of half of society, and you did so because your mother arranged a more advantageous match. What assurance do I have that something similar will not happen again, the moment another obligation arises? None, he admitted. I cannot offer you certainty, only patience and consistency, proven through actions rather than promises. If you will permit it, I would like to visit, not with grand gestures or elaborate declarations, but simply as a friend, allowing you to observe for yourself whether the change I speak of is genuine. Elena considered this proposal carefully, weighing it against the careful peace she had built for herself in the weeks since the garden, against the quiet friendship growing with Henry, against the very real possibility that opening this door again might only lead to further heartbreak. I will not make this easy for you, she said finally. I would not expect you to. You may visit, Elena said, but you will not receive special treatment, nor will I set aside the life I have built simply because you have decided you regret your choice. If you truly wish to earn back my trust, you will need to show it through patience, through respecting the boundaries I set, and through proving, over time, that your change of heart extends beyond mere words. I accept those terms, Alexander said, and something in his voice carried a sincerity that Elena had not heard from him before, not even in their happiest days together. What followed over the coming weeks was neither swift nor dramatic, but rather a slow, careful rebuilding, conducted in small moments rather than grand gestures. Alexander began visiting the bookshop regularly, never overstaying his welcome, never pressing for more than Elena was willing to offer. He helped Charlotte carry heavy boxes of new stock without being asked, engaged Henry in genuinely friendly conversation whenever their visits happened to overlap, and listened, truly listened, when Elena spoke of her growing interest in managing the shop's finances, asking thoughtful questions rather than simply nodding along out of politeness. You seem different, Charlotte observed one afternoon, watching Alexander help a young customer locate a book on the highest shelf, patient and genuinely engaged, rather than merely performing kindness for an audience. I am trying to be, Alexander said honestly, though I understand that trying alone does not erase what came before. No, Charlotte agreed, but it is a beginning at least. Elena watched these small exchanges from a careful distance, allowing herself to notice, without fully committing to hope, protecting the fragile peace she had built with the same careful vigilance she applied to the shop's ledgers. There were days when Alexander's presence felt like a comfort she had missed more than she wanted to admit, and other days when old wounds resurfaced sharply enough that she found herself curt with him, testing whether his patience would hold under genuine strain. It always did. You do not have to keep coming back, she told him one particularly difficult afternoon, after a customer had made a pointed comment about the broken engagement that left her flustered and irritable for the remainder of the day. I was unkind to you earlier, and you did not deserve it. You owe me no apology, Elena, Alexander said gently. I understand fully why difficult days arise, and I do not expect you to manage them gracefully every single time, particularly not on my account. Elena studied him carefully, searching for any sign of the careless, duty-bound man who had once stood in that garden, and found instead someone who seemed genuinely willing to weather her difficult moments without retreating. Henry, for his part, observed the growing dynamic between Elena and Alexander with a quiet grace of his own, understanding gradually that whatever gentle friendship he had built with Elena, however genuine, existed alongside a deeper history he could not fully compete with. He raised the matter directly one afternoon, catching Elena alone while Alexander had stepped out briefly to fetch fresh water for the shop's small collection of potted plants. You care for him still, Henry said, not unkindly, more observation than accusation. Elena did not deny it. I am not certain what I feel, Henry. beyond confusion and caution in equal measure. I have enjoyed our friendship a great deal, Elena, Henry said carefully, and I would not wish to stand in the way of whatever you and the Duke are working to rebuild, if that is truly what is happening here. You have been a genuine comfort to me these past weeks, Elena said, reaching out to squeeze his hand gently. I hope you know how much your friendship has meant, regardless of what happens with Alexander. I know, Henry said, offering a small, resigned smile. And I hope, whatever you decide, that you find genuine happiness, Elena. You deserve nothing less. The conversation left Elena with a great deal to consider, and that evening, sitting alone in her small room above the shop, she found herself finally allowing the full weight of her feelings to surface, no longer held carefully at arm's length. She still loved Alexander. She had never truly stopped, despite every effort to build a life that did not depend on him. The question that remained was whether she could trust that love enough to risk her heart a second time. It was nearly 2 months after his first visit to the bookshop that Alexander arrived one evening with a different energy than his usual careful, patient demeanor, something more urgent beneath his composed exterior. I have something to tell you, he said, once Charlotte had discreetly retreated to the back room, leaving them alone among the quiet shelves. What is it? My mother has asked, several times now, when I intend to formally court you again, properly, with intentions toward marriage rather than simply quiet visits and patient friendship. He paused, gathering his thoughts carefully. I told her that decision belongs entirely to you, Elena, not to me, and certainly not to her. I have spent these past 2 months trying to prove, through action rather than words, that I am capable of choosing you honestly, without the shadow of duty or family expectation clouding that choice. Whether you believe that proof has been sufficient is not something I can determine on your behalf. Elena set down the book she had been holding, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. And if I told you I needed more time, then I would wait, Alexander said simply. For as long as you required, I have learned, these past months, that genuine love is patient by nature, not because patience is easy, but because the alternative, rushing you toward a decision you are not ready to make, would only prove that I had learned nothing at all from my previous mistake. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any trace of the careless duty that had once driven him to end things so abruptly in that autumn garden. She found instead a steadiness that had not existed before, earned through weeks of small, consistent proof rather than a single grand declaration. I do not need more time, she said finally, her voice quiet but certain. I have watched you these past months, Alexander, and I have seen genuine change. Not perfect, not without difficulty, but genuine nonetheless. I am tired of protecting myself from a possibility that has already proven itself worthy of trust. Alexander's breath caught, hope rising cautiously in his expression. Elena, I am not the same woman who stood in that garden and accepted your rejection with quiet grace, Elena continued. That woman built a life for herself, learned to stand on her own, discovered a strength she had not fully known she possessed. If I choose you now, Alexander, it will not be because I need you to complete me, but because I want you, genuinely, as an equal partner in whatever life we build together. That is precisely the woman I have fallen in love with, Alexander said, stepping closer, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer felt any need to hide. Not the woman who simply accepted her fate quietly, but the woman who rebuilt herself entirely, who made me understand, through her own quiet strength, exactly what I stood to lose. Elena allowed herself, finally, to smile fully, without the careful restraint she had maintained for so many months. Then perhaps, Alexander, we might finally begin building something worth the wait. He reached for her hand, and this time she did not pull away. Their engagement, when it was formally announced weeks later, carried none of the cold calculation that had marked his previous arrangement. Margaret, to everyone's surprise, welcomed Elena with genuine warmth, having come to understand, through her own quiet reflection on her husband's journal, exactly what her son stood to gain by choosing love over mere advantage. Charlotte wept openly with joy, and Grace declared, with her usual practical wisdom, that she had known all along things would eventually find their proper course, provided both parties were patient enough to let genuine change prove itself over time. The wedding, held the following spring in the very garden where their story had once nearly ended, was a quiet, intimate affair, attended by those who had witnessed both the heartbreak and the patient rebuilding that followed. Elena wore a simple gown, much like the one she had chosen for the gala that had changed everything, and as she walked toward Alexander beneath an arch of early spring blossoms, she carried with her not the fragile hope of a woman waiting to be rescued, but the quiet confidence of a woman who had chosen her own path, and found, at the end of it, a love that had finally proven itself worthy of her trust. 3 years passed, and the small bookshop above which Elena had once nursed a broken heart had grown into something far larger than either she or Charlotte had ever imagined possible. With Alexander's quiet support, offered only when asked and never imposed, Elena expanded the shop into the adjoining building, creating a proper lending library that served families across the city who could never have afforded books of their own. She managed the accounts herself, exactly as she had during those difficult early weeks, though now the numbers told a story of genuine success rather than simple survival. Margaret in her later years had become an unexpected ally in this venture, offering both her considerable social connections and, more surprisingly, her genuine enthusiasm, having discovered in Elena's quiet determination something she recognized and admired from her own younger years, before duty had narrowed her sense of what was possible. The two women, so different in temperament, had built a relationship neither had anticipated, rooted in mutual respect rather than mere family obligation. "Your father would have approved of this match," Margaret told Alexander one afternoon, watching Elena review new arrivals with the same careful attention she gave to everything she cared about. "Though I confess, it took me far too long to understand what he had tried to tell me, in his own quiet way, all those years ago." "You could not have known, Mother." "Perhaps not," Margaret admitted. "But I am grateful, at least, that you found the courage to choose differently than he did, and that I found the wisdom, eventually, to support that choice rather than stand in its way." Life had not been entirely without its difficulties. Cordelia, now married to a wealthy merchant she had chosen with the same calculated precision she brought to every decision, occasionally crossed paths with Elena and Alexander at social gatherings neither could fully avoid. Their encounters had softened over time into something approaching civility, though never warmth, each woman having built a life that satisfied her own particular needs, however differently defined. "I hope you are happy," Cordelia told Elena once, at a charity event neither had particularly wished to attend. "Genuinely, I did not understand at the time what I was giving up by viewing marriage as I did. I understand it better now, watching you and Alexander together." "Thank you," Elena said simply, recognizing in Cordelia's admission something that required no further response beyond quiet acceptance. Henry, too, had found his own happiness, marrying a kind, practical woman who shared his genuine love of agricultural improvement and asked nothing of him beyond honest companionship. He remained a welcome friend at the bookshop, bringing his young children to browse the shelves on quiet Sunday afternoons. His earlier hopes for Elena settled comfortably into a friendship that had only deepened with time. Grace, ever the practical voice of wisdom, had eventually found her own match in a steady young merchant who valued her sharp judgment as much as her warm heart, and the two friends continued their weekly visits, now often accompanied by children who tumbled happily between the bookshop's crowded shelves, filling the quiet space with laughter that would have seemed impossible during those difficult early months. Alexander, for his part, had transformed his approach to managing the Whitmore estate, applying the same patient consistency that had rebuilt Elena's trust to every aspect of his responsibilities. He consulted his tenants directly rather than relying solely on distant reports, invested in improvements that genuinely benefited the families under his care, and made a point of visiting his father's old library regularly, not out of obligation, but because he had come to treasure the quiet space where he had first discovered the truth that changed everything. "Do you ever wonder," Elena asked him one evening, as they sat together in that very library, "what might have happened had you never found your father's journal?" Alexander considered the question carefully, watching the fire crackle in the hearth before them. "I have wondered exactly that, more than once. I suspect I would have married Cordelia, built a life of quiet, comfortable misery, and spent my later years wondering, exactly as my father did, what I had given up in the name of duty. And I would have built my life around the bookshop, around Henry's friendship, around whatever quiet happiness I could construct for myself," Elena said thoughtfully. "I do not think I would have been unhappy exactly, but I do not think I would have known this particular joy either. I am grateful, every single day, that circumstances led me to that journal," Alexander said, reaching for her hand, "and grateful, beyond what words can properly express, that you were willing to grant me the chance to prove myself worthy of a second opportunity." "You earned that opportunity," Elena said gently, "through patience, through consistency, through respecting the boundaries I needed to protect my own heart. I did not simply hand it to you freely." "No," Alexander agreed, smiling. "You made certain I understood exactly what genuine love required, and I am a better man for having learned that lesson properly, rather than assuming it would simply arrive without effort." Their story, as it settled into the quiet rhythms of ordinary married life, became something of a gentle legend among those who had witnessed its most difficult chapters. Young women in the city, hearing whispered versions of the tale from mothers or aunts who remembered the scandal well, took a particular comfort in its lesson, understanding that grace, patience, and genuine self-respect could carry a person through even the most painful rejection, and that true love, when it finally arrived, required proof far more substantial than pretty words alone. Elena often told the story herself, to the young women who came to work in her growing library, sharing not the romantic gloss that gossip had eventually applied to it, but the honest, difficult truth of what she had actually lived through, the quiet grief of rejection, the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding a life without depending on anyone else for her sense of worth, and the careful, patient testing she had required before allowing herself to trust again. Grace is not about pretending you do not feel pain, she would tell them. It is about refusing to let that pain define how you carry yourself forward, and love, when it returns after such a loss, must prove itself through action, not merely through words, however beautifully spoken those words might be. Alexander, listening from the doorway of the library on one such afternoon, felt a familiar warmth settle over him, gratitude mixed with quiet pride, understanding fully that the woman he had once let go, in a moment of misguided duty, had become not merely his wife, but his equal in every genuine sense, a partner whose strength and wisdom continued to shape him into a better version of himself with each passing year. Their children, when they eventually arrived, grew up surrounded by books, by the quiet hum of a library that served the entire city, by parents who modeled, in their daily lives, exactly what patient, honest love looked like when it had been properly earned, rather than simply assumed. And though the scandal of the broken engagement and the quiet grace of Elena's original acceptance had long since faded from the sharpest edges of city gossip, the deeper truth of their story remained, passed quietly from one generation to the next. That dignity, patience, and genuine self-respect were never wasted, even when love seemed, for a time, entirely lost, and that the truest kind of love was the kind proven slowly, through consistent action, long after the first apology had already been spoken and accepted.